I saved for 5 years to buy a home. My family tried to take it away. I finally bought my own house after years of saving every dollar I could. Then my parents accused me of stealing my sister's inheritance and even filed a lawsuit claiming the house rightfully belonged to her. Growing up in a family where my father, Robert, treated every opinion like an unquestionable command, and my mother, Charlotte, turned those commands into guilt, taught me very early how to navigate impossible expectations. My younger sister, Isabella, never had to carry that burden. She moved through life wrapped in their approval, attention, and unwavering protection because they always believed she needed more help than I did. I learned at a very young age that fairness was never truly practiced in our household. Expectations mattered more than equality. Even so, I worked as hard as I possibly could. My career became my entire focus. Night after night, I sat in front of my laptop with my hair tied back and my eyes burning from exhaustion, constantly reminding myself that discipline would eventually buy me freedom, the kind of freedom I never experienced growing up. For 5 straight years, I saved every penny I could. There are no spontaneous shopping trips, no vacations, no expensive nights out. I packed homemade lunches and brought them to work every single day. Every bonus check I earned went directly into my savings account without hesitation. Each promotion pushed me one step closer to my dream of owning something that truly belonged to me. A home, a place where I could finally feel secure. The night I told my family I had finally saved enough money for a down payment, Charlotte reacted with overwhelming excitement. She clapped her hands together as if she had been waiting years to hear that news. "Oh, sweetheart, we're so proud of you," she said while decorating the dining table with little lights, treating the occasion like a holiday celebration. Robert simply nodded in approval and said, "Smart investment, as long as you do it right." For a brief moment, I actually allowed myself to feel proud. Then Isabella leaned back in her chair, slowly stirring her iced tea before saying, "Must be nice having that engineering salary. Some of us are still paying off grad school." Her tone sounded casual, but there was no humor behind it. I forced myself to smile anyway. "You're doing well at your firm, too. You'll get there eventually." She didn't answer. She never did when my accomplishments became the center of attention she believed belonged to her instead. The atmosphere around her always changed whenever she felt overshadowed, growing tense with quiet resentment. Still, I kept moving forward. Every weekend after work, I drove through peaceful neighborhoods looking at houses, imagining a life where nobody had the authority to question or rewrite my decisions. When I finally found the place I would eventually buy, a modest 3-bedroom house on a quiet street near the edge of the city, I immediately knew it was the one. It wasn't luxurious, and it certainly wasn't perfect, but it was mine. Completely mine. The moment I signed the paperwork felt unreal. What I didn't realize at the time was that this house, the one I had sacrificed years to earn, would become the spark that exposed every ugly truth about my family. It would destroy every illusion I still had about who they really were. My phone began ringing nonstop without a single pause between calls. I was sitting on the floor of my new living room, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes after finally closing the sale on the house. 2 days after officially becoming the owner of my property, my phone would not stop ringing. At first, I decided to ignore it. I was exhausted, drenched in sweat, and still holding a screwdriver in one hand while trying to finish unpacking the house. But the moment Sophie's name flashed across my screen along with the message, "You need to see this right now," a painful knot immediately tightened in my stomach. She had sent me a screenshot of a social media post through email. The post had been written by Isabella. It was dramatic, exaggerated, and overflowing with self-pity. The post had already collected hundreds of likes and sympathetic comments from strangers online. When your sister uses the money grandma intended for your first home to buy one for herself instead. Below it were endless comments from people I had never even met, calling me selfish, greedy, fake, and heartless. I couldn't even swallow properly. I stared at the screen and read the post again, this time much slower, hoping I had misunderstood it the first time. But I hadn't. Isabella was openly accusing me of stealing money that never existed in the first place. There had never been any inheritance fund for her. Grandma had never created one, and nobody in the family had ever mentioned such a thing before. My phone rang again before I finally answered Sophie's call. "Olivia," she said carefully. "Your dad called me earlier." A cold sensation spread through my chest immediately. Not long after that, Robert himself called. "Hello," he said in a flat, official tone that sounded more like a business conversation than a call between father and daughter. I stayed completely still while gripping the phone tighter. "We need to discuss the situation involving the house," he continued. "What situation?" I asked slowly. In the background, I could hear Charlotte's voice. "Honey, you know exactly what this is about." "No," I replied firmly. "Actually, I don't." Robert let out a long, irritated sigh, as though I were making things difficult on purpose. "Your mother and I have already spoken with an attorney," he explained. "The money intended for Isabella's future home was supposed to go to her." My heartbeat became so violent I could practically feel it shaking through my wrists. "What are you even talking about?" I demanded. "There was never any money set aside for her. I bought this house with my own savings. I can prove every deposit and every payment." For several seconds, there was only silence. Then Robert said something that completely shattered my sense of reality. "That house belongs to your sister." The words hit me so hard I immediately sank down onto the nearest step. "Dad, this is insane," I whispered. "There was never any agreement. There was never any fund." "You're making this far more complicated than it needs to be," he snapped back. "Your sister needs that house more than you do. She's been planning for it, and now you've taken it away from her." "She never once told me she wanted this house," I argued. "It doesn't matter," he answered coldly. "We'll be filing in court tomorrow." My hand shook so badly I almost dropped the phone onto the floor. Then Charlotte spoke, sounding disappointed and offended all at once. "Are you seriously going to force this into a legal battle?" she asked. "We're only trying to do what's fair for your sister. She deserves this house. You'll be able to buy another one someday." Another one? As if 5 years of sacrifice, discipline, and exhaustion could simply be repeated without consequence. As if rebuilding my life from scratch was as easy as buying groceries from a store. The phone call ended without a single goodbye. I sat alone in the dim hallway of my new house, feeling a level of betrayal I never imagined possible, not even in my worst nightmares. The painful truth finally became impossible to ignore. My parents were not confused. They knew exactly what they were doing. They had already chosen which side they were standing on, and it was never going to be mine. Later that evening, Sophie arrived carrying takeout containers and a look on her face that told me she already knew everything that had happened. "You're not crazy," she said quietly while setting the food down. A few seconds later, Jack walked in behind her. I hadn't even realized he was coming too. He folded his arms tightly across his chest before speaking. "They're trying to take your house away," he said bluntly. That night, sleep never came. I knew I had to warn Olivia and prepare her for the reality that my family was about to drag me into a legal war. And judging by their behavior, they were absolutely serious about it. Hours later, I sat at the kitchen counter inside Sophie's apartment, holding a cup of cold tea while staring blankly into space as conversations buzzed around me. The shock still hadn't completely settled in. The shock still hadn't completely faded. Instead, it had transformed into something heavier, something sharper that sat painfully inside my chest and refused to loosen its grip. Sophie sat directly across from me at the kitchen counter, leaning forward with both elbows resting against the surface. "You are absolutely not staying alone in that house tonight," she said firmly, leaving no room for discussion. For once, I didn't argue. The truth was, I didn't think I could handle being there by myself anymore. The next morning, Jack arrived carrying a thick folder tucked beneath his arm. Without wasting time, he placed it down in front of me. "You need a specialist," he explained. "Someone who deals with property disputes and inheritance claims." Then he handed me a business card. "The best attorney I know for this kind of situation is Grace Langston." I blinked at him in confusion. "There isn't even an inheritance issue," I said weakly. Jack gave a humorless smile. "Your parents are trying very hard to create one." That same afternoon, Sophie and I met Grace at her office downtown. The entire space reflected the same controlled precision she carried herself with glass walls, soft lighting, perfectly organized shelves, and not a single object out of place. She listened silently while I explained everything in detail, from Isabella's social media accusations to Robert threatening legal action over the house. She didn't interrupt once. She simply sat there, taking notes while carefully observing me. When I finally finished speaking, Grace leaned back slightly in her chair and folded her hands together. "Their case sounds entirely fabricated," she said calmly. "But even weak lawsuits can still create serious problems if they aren't handled correctly." I swallowed hard while she continued. "We'll need proof of every payment connected to the house. Bank statements, savings records, transfers, anything showing the property was purchased solely with your earned income." "I have all of it," I answered immediately. "Every deposit, every paycheck, every savings log." Grace nodded approvingly while lightly tapping her pen against the desk. "That's good," she replied. For the first time in hours, I felt like I could finally breathe normally again. "Now we need witness statements," she continued. "Who in your family knew the inheritance was divided equally?" "My Aunt Victoria and my Uncle Thomas," I answered quickly. "Then contact them immediately," Grace said without hesitation. "We need their statements as soon as possible." Thomas answered his phone on the second ring. "Olivia, sweetheart, I heard something was going on," he said before I could even explain anything. The moment I told him the full story, his reaction was immediate. "Your grandmother would be furious if she knew about this," he said sharply. "I'll sign whatever documents you need." Aunt Victoria's response was quieter, but somehow far more painful. "I was always afraid this would happen eventually," she admitted softly. "Your father asked your grandparents years ago to change the will so Isabella would receive more money than you. They refused, and he never truly accepted their decision." She paused for a moment before continuing. "If you need me to testify in court, I will." Little by little, the truth finally began taking shape in front of me. This situation hadn't appeared out of nowhere. It wasn't sudden at all. It was the result of years of silent expectations being built behind closed doors. Years of Isabella being promised things that were never actually hers. Years of my parents quietly believing she deserved more than I did. Then, 2 nights later, things became even worse. Sophie and I returned to my house so I could collect the rest of my belongings, but the second we pulled into the driveway, we noticed movement on the porch. Someone was standing at the front door, aggressively shaking the handle. It was Isabella. She was trying to force a key into the lock, a key I had never given her. "What are you doing?" I shouted the moment I got out of the car. She jumped back in shock and stared at me with wide eyes. "I thought I could come look around," she muttered defensively. "It's going to be my house eventually anyway." That single moment changed everything inside me. Grace later described the incident as attempted unauthorized entry, valuable evidence supporting my case. But for me, it became something else entirely. The fear I had been drowning in finally hardened into something stronger, something colder, something determined. If my family truly wanted a legal war, then they were going to have one. And this time, they were going to fight it alone. The courtroom carried the sharp scent of disinfectant mixed with the dry smell of old paper. There was nothing comforting about it. As I walked beside Grace through the hallway, it felt as though the walls themselves were vibrating with every beat of my heart. I could feel each pulse pounding through my chest. My hands trembled slightly, and my breathing refused to settle into a steady rhythm. At that point, I wasn't even terrified of losing the house anymore. What truly frightened me was standing face to face with the people who raised me and finally accepting that they were no longer the people I once believed they were. When we entered the courtroom, Robert, Charlotte, and Isabella were already seated at the plaintiff's table. The instant my father's eyes met mine, he straightened his posture as though preparing himself for battle. Charlotte quickly looked away, her expression carrying a strange combination of arrogance and bitterness. Isabella slowly looked me up and down as if she genuinely believed I had betrayed her. Grace gently placed her hand against my arm. The moment Judge Rebecca Lawson entered the courtroom, every sound immediately disappeared. Silence fell so completely it almost felt heavy. "Remain calm," Grace whispered quietly beside me. "We are not here to fight emotions. We are here to present facts." Judge Lawson possessed the kind of commanding presence that automatically forced everyone in the room to sit straighter without even realizing it. She carried herself with calm authority and an expression that made it obvious she had absolutely no patience for unnecessary drama or nonsense. "Let's begin," she instructed firmly. My parents' attorney, Philip Carter, stood first. "Your Honor," he began smoothly, "this case concerns a verbal family agreement regarding the distribution of inheritance. An agreement that Miss Olivia violated when she used funds intended for her sister Isabella to purchase a property for herself." The phrase verbal agreement made my stomach twist painfully. Philip continued speaking with complete confidence. "We maintain that the property purchased by Miss Olivia was always intended for Isabella based on years of family discussions and mutual understanding." Beside me, Grace remained perfectly still and expressionless. She didn't react at all. She simply waited patiently until Philip returned to his seat. Then she rose calmly to her feet with the confidence of someone already holding a winning hand. "Your Honor," she began, "the plaintiffs are claiming the existence of a verbal agreement that has no witnesses, no documentation, and absolutely no mention within the legally executed will left behind by the deceased grandparents." She paused briefly before continuing. "Meanwhile, the defendant has submitted detailed financial records proving that every dollar used to purchase her home came directly from 5 years of earned income and personal savings." Judge Lawson nodded thoughtfully. Philip then called Robert to the witness stand as his first witness. My father stood up slowly, inhaled deeply, and turned toward the courtroom like a man finally receiving the recognition he believed he deserved. "Charlotte and I always intended to help Isabella purchase her first home," he testified confidently. "It was understood within the family. Olivia knew that." I clenched my jaw so tightly it hurt. Grace lightly touched my arm again, grounding me before I could react emotionally. Charlotte was called next. She spoke with carefully controlled emotion, allowing her voice to tremble just enough to make herself appear sympathetic. "We never wanted to hurt Olivia," she said softly. "We only want to honor the promise that was made to Isabella." A promise. Another vague word with no evidence holding it together. Then Isabella was called to the stand. She inhaled shakily before smoothing the wrinkles from her skirt and looking toward the judge with watery eyes. "I've been trying to save money for years," she explained quietly. "But I don't earn nearly as much as Olivia does." Her voice cracked at exactly the right moment. I truly believe she knew the house was supposed to be mine. Philip gently placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder as she stepped down from the witness stand, reinforcing the image they were trying so desperately to create. Then it was Grace's turn. She stood with perfect posture and an unwavering gaze before addressing the court. "Your Honor, the defense would like to call Thomas Langston as our first witness." My uncle entered the courtroom with calm dignity, carrying himself like someone who had absolutely nothing to prove. Once seated in the witness box, he delivered his testimony clearly and without hesitation. Philip attempted several times to challenge his statements, but Thomas never changed his position. "There were no special promises," he stated firmly. "No conditions. I was present when the will was read. The inheritance was divided equally between both granddaughters." After him, Aunt Victoria took the stand. Although she moved slowly, her voice remained steady and certain. "Robert asked our parents to change the will so Isabella would receive a larger share," she testified openly. "They refused." The entire courtroom fell completely silent. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. And for the first time since the lawsuit began, I saw a genuine panic flash across my father's face. "They refused," Victoria continued firmly. "They believed fairness mattered." Charlotte immediately lowered her eyes and looked away. Robert's jaw tightened so hard I could see the muscles visibly clenching beneath his skin. After Victoria finished testifying, Grace turned toward me with a calm and reassuring expression before quietly signaling that it was my turn to take the stand. The moment I sat down in the witness chair, The microphone felt unbearably loud and far too close to my face. Still, speaking honestly felt easier than I expected. It felt like finally breathing after being trapped underwater. I saved money for 5 years, I said clearly. Grace handed a carefully organized folder to Judge Lawson. We can account for every single dollar, she explained. Not 1 cent of inheritance money was used to purchase this home. Judge Lawson slowly reviewed the paperwork in front of her. These documents contained detailed records of savings accounts, payroll deposits, bank transfers, income statements, and financial activity covering a period of 5 years, she stated while carefully examining each page. Then Grace added something else. Your Honor, there is one additional matter we would like to address. At those words, Isabella abruptly lifted her head. Grace ignored her reaction completely. 2 nights before mediation, Isabella attempted to enter the defendant's property using a key that did not belong to her. I wasn't trying to break in, Isabella blurted out immediately. I only wanted to look around. Grace remained perfectly calm. A neighbor witnessed the incident and contacted the authorities, she continued before handing another document to the judge. The defendant chose not to press charges, but this behavior clearly demonstrates the plaintiff's belief that they were entitled to the property regardless of legal ownership. Philip immediately objected. That has absolutely nothing to do with this case, he argued sharply. Grace responded in the same composed tone she had maintained the entire trial. It directly reflects the foundation of this dispute. Judge Lawson raised one hand, silencing the courtroom instantly. The atmosphere in the room became painfully tense beneath the intensity of her gaze. I have reviewed all submitted material, she said carefully. They will divide the inheritance equally. There is no evidence whatsoever of a financial arrangement assigning specific funds or property to Isabella. Furthermore, the defendant purchased the home entirely with her own earned income. She paused deliberately, allowing the silence to settle heavily across the courtroom. Isabella's face turned pale. As for the attempted unauthorized entry, Judge Lawson continued, that escalation is deeply concerning. Then she delivered the words that changed everything. This case is dismissed in its entirety. The sound of the gavel echoed sharply through the room. The plaintiffs are permanently barred from refiling these claims. At that exact moment, it felt as though a crushing weight that had been pressing against my chest for months suddenly disappeared. It wasn't relief exactly. It felt more like finally forcing air back into my lungs after nearly suffocating. Charlotte covered her mouth with one trembling hand, completely speechless. Robert stared at me with an expression filled with anger, disbelief, humiliation, and wounded pride all at once. Tears gathered in Isabella's eyes. The second we stepped out into the hallway, Robert came after us. This isn't over, he snapped angrily. We're still family. For the first time during the entire ordeal, I turned fully toward him without hesitation. Families do not drag each other into court over lies, I said steadily. Families don't try to steal things someone else spent years working for. You made your choice. Charlotte reached toward my hand desperately, but I stepped back before she could touch me. I never wanted this fight, she whispered weakly. You already started it, I answered quietly. Then Isabella finally spoke through a broken sob. That house was supposed to be mine. I looked directly at her. No, I replied softly. It never was. But you never cared enough to learn the truth. You only cared about receiving everything people promised you. For the first time in her life, she looked uncertain, vulnerable, almost lost. Grace stepped beside me again with the same calm confidence she had carried all day. We're finished here, she said simply. And we truly were. When I walked out of the courthouse, I didn't feel victorious. The emotion was quieter than that. It was peace. It was freedom. It was the strange feeling of finally reclaiming something invisible that had been taken from me years ago. Somehow, even my parents seemed to understand that. That evening, as I drove home, the sun slowly disappeared beneath the rooftops and painted the entire street in a soft orange glow. For the first time in months, looking at my own front door didn't make my stomach twist with anxiety. When I stepped inside, silence wrapped around me like a warm blanket. There was no fear, No tension. No one tried to convince me that what belonged to me should belong to someone else instead. Sophie arrived, first carrying takeout containers and smiling as though I had just survived a war. She wrapped her arms tightly around me. "You did it," she whispered proudly. Jack arrived shortly afterward carrying a bottle of sparkling cider. "Not many people walk into a courtroom against their entire family and walk out stronger," he said honestly. Grace came last, still composed as always, but this time her smile felt softer and more genuine than I had ever seen before. Thomas called later that evening to tell me that both he and Victoria were incredibly proud of me. "Justice doesn't fix every wound," Grace said quietly before leaving, "but it gives you room to breathe again." Her words stayed with me long after the night settled in. My grandparents had always believed fairness mattered, and for the first time in years, I finally felt connected to that belief again. Not simply because we shared blood, but because some people had chosen to stand beside me when everything else collapsed. I slowly walked across the living room, brushed my fingers across the smooth surface of the table I had just polished, and opened the windows to let the cool night air flow inside. This house no longer felt like just another purchase. It wasn't merely an address anymore. It truly felt like home again, completely, unquestionably, and entirely mine. Standing in the doorway that night, I realized something simple but unshakable. Family cannot be defined only by blood or tradition. It cannot be limited to the people who believe they know what is best for you while ignoring your voice completely. Real family is made up of the people who remain beside you when everything falls apart. I didn't just win a legal case. I reclaimed my home, my boundaries, my voice, and my life. And if you have ever found yourself fighting for what rightfully belongs to you, or standing against people trying to rewrite your story, then you are not alone.